Hello, welcome everyone this afternoon. We're all going to get started, so we'll give everyone a couple of moments to filter in. My name is Kevin Richardson with Halt Harm Network. We're co-hosting this call with West Virginia Rivers, and we're really excited for today's presentation with Autumn Crowe. I thank all of you all for making time to join us this afternoon. We really appreciate everyone's support and participation. I'll just say really quickly, Halt to Harm, we're really grateful to be able to host these events and to partner with groups like this and share this information. So we're really excited to continue putting these on. For anyone who's not familiar with us, we're a network of anti-fracking, anti-oil and gas pollution groups, activists, and leaders across the country. We provide support, including technical campaign support, putting on webinars like these, connecting people to resources and other things to help folks in the fight against the oil and gas industry. You can learn more at our website, halttheharm.net, and you can also join the network. There's a link down below to join the network, and I'll drop that in the chat in just a second. But before we get started, we're going to do a quick little icebreaker to kind of figure out where everyone's coming from. One of the cool things about these events is, we're a nationwide network, and it's interesting to see where folks are located at any given webinar. The Mountain Valley Pipeline issue is one that affects the globe because of the climate implications, affects different states and different counties in different ways. And so I'm really curious to see where folks are coming from today. So I'm going to share my screen and show us all a map. And when I do that, and folks who have been on our calls before are probably pretty familiar with this by now, but when I pop on this map, if you just enter your location, your city and state in the chat, it will start populating your location on the map. So you can enter your city and state or your county and state in the chat, and it should show where everyone's coming from. And this will give us a good idea of where folks are joining us. We got a couple from Texas. We got one in Austin, I recognize Robin. A couple of people from California, Colorado, West Virginia folks coming out to support Autumn. I love it. There you go. So, folks in the Northeast, some Pennsylvania folks, someone from South Carolina. That's wonderful. Missouri, getting a nice kind of mix of folks from across the nation. It's great. Yeah, if you're just joining us, just drop your city and state or county and state in the chat, and I'll populate the map, and we'll get kind of a sense where people are coming from. A lot of West Virginia folks coming. That's great. A few more Texas folks. Cool. Yeah, I'll give it one more minute. Just keep populating. Some folks from Virginia as well, a good amount from the Northeast area. Great. Just give about one more minute to see where folks are coming from. More from South Carolina. Yes, folks from Colorado. Cool. That's more from Pennsylvania and Missouri. Awesome. That's good. We got a good mix of people from the Northeast and some folks from the West and South. Cool. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the screen share for this. But it's great to see where everyone's coming from. Thanks for all the folks joining us tonight. Cool. I'm just gonna do a quick introduction and talk about the Q&A, and then we're gonna pass everything over to Autumn for her presentation. So I just got a lot to cover today. So we're really want to make sure she has enough time to get to it, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Okay. Cool. So we'll have the presentation and then we'll have a Q&A. For the Q&A, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. You're welcome to do this as we go along, as well as at the end of the Q&A. And then also, folks, if you want to come off mute and ask your questions and have more of a conversation, just raise your hand. And here's how to access the raise your hand function on Zoom. I know many of us have kind of been through enough Zoom calls since the pandemic to recognize these functions, but it's always good to go over them again. So you just select reactions and select raise hand, and then I'll call on folks to ask their questions. And we should have a good amount of time for Q&A, so I invite folks to have a conversation, ask some really interesting questions, and think of further ways for collaboration. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of our speaker today, Autumn Crowe from West Virginia Rivers Coalition. Autumn grew up swimming and fishing in the waters of the Greenbrier River, where she gained her love of nature and desire to protect the environment. She obtained a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Protection and a Master's of Science in Soil Science from West Virginia University. After graduating, Autumn spent 7 years working with tribes in Alaska and Nevada. In 2015, she returned home to West Virginia to serve as program director for West Virginia Rivers Coalition, working to protect the state's scenic rivers and headwater streams. When not working, Autumn enjoys spending time outdoors with her family, hunting, fishing, hiking, paddling, and biking. I'm really excited. Autumn, as you know, has quite a bit of experience. She's been there almost since the beginning of the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight, I think since the beginning. And she's going to give us a nice overview of the last 8 years of the fight against it, where things are standing, recent victories, some of the organizing and legal strategies around water permitting in West Virginia, which will give us a kind of a good overview of where things are at. As you guys probably know from the emails, there was a big victory recently in April where the U.S. Fourth Court of Appeals threw out a water permit from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, without which they can't continue building along streams in the state. So this is a big victory. It's obviously not the end of the battle. These things will continue, and that's what Adam's going to talk about today, but that at least shows the importance of where we're at and how important these organizing strategies are. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it to Autumn to start her presentation.
Well, thanks, Kevin, for Halt the Harm inviting me on here. And thank you all for being here to join me today to talk about the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up the presentation. Okay, so you all should be seeing my slides.
Looks good.
Great. So yeah, we have been in this battle to protect water resources from the Mountain Valley Pipeline for the last 8 years. This project was first proposed in 2014. I'm going to cover a very light overview of what's happened in the past 8 years, because we could spend the entire day just talking about the different legal challenges and the roller coaster ride that's been the approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. But basically, they rushed the approval process for these permits. They cut corners and they wound up in federal court because they were not complying with the environmental regulations that are there to protect our water resources. So now this project is billions of dollars over budget. It's 5 years behind schedule, and only about 55% has actually achieved final restoration. So you'll see figures in the media that, the pipeline is 90% complete. There's only 20 miles left to construct. And that's really inaccurate because there's a lot of pipe that's still laying out on the ground. And there's very small sections that are actually complete. Even in the first few miles, one of the first stream crossings, there's only a few miles of the pipeline that is actually all segmented and in place and in the ground. So there's multiple sections that are incomplete. And so over the last 8 years, we've been advocating for the protection of our waters and our communities in West Virginia. We've attended public meetings, we've held community meetings to help the folks understand what this project is about. We hosted town halls with our elected officials to educate them on the impacts of this project. We had action alerts to enable the public to be able to comment on all of the permits and explain what those permits entail, because there's a lot of approvals that went into this project. And then realizing that this project was going to be very impactful on our water resources, 1,000 streams and wetlands impacted by this project. We developed, in partnership with Trout Unlimited, a pipeline monitoring program where we trained thousands of volunteers to get out and monitor water quality, to set up monitoring locations along the route, to be able to establish baseline conditions, and then do a visual assessment once the pipeline began construction in 2018 to identify pollution impacts and be able to report those to our regulatory agencies. And so what we found is that MVP's erosion controls were ineffective. We are dealing with very rugged terrain in the Appalachian Mountains. There's a reason why when you look at a pipeline map of the entire country, there's a big blank space in this section of West Virginia. And that's because we have very steep slopes, highly erodible soils, and that combined creates conditions that are not conducive to pipeline construction. And so when you take all of the hillside and you remove the trees and you construct this pipeline down a very steep slope, the erosion controls that are in place for this project are going to be ineffective. And we saw that every time it rained, their erosion controls failed. They were not installing them properly. They were not maintaining them properly. And so we witnessed just massive amounts of sediment entering our rivers and streams. So as I mentioned, we had hundreds of people on the ground monitoring the construction, and those reports that were sent to us were forwarded to the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. That agency cited MVP for over 250 erosion control deficiencies that resulted in around 50 water quality violations. And so not only the impacts to our water quality, we are also dealing with impacts to our climate. So the agency analysis failed to consider the cost of all of these greenhouse gas emissions from the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And MVP's completion will lock us into increased emissions, and that will contribute to the climate crisis that we're facing right now. So this is it's not just a problem for West Virginia and Appalachia. It's a problem for the whole world because we have to be moving away from fossil fuels in order to address the climate crisis. And this actually increases the emissions of methane, which is even more potent than carbon as a greenhouse gas. So where are we at in the current status of the Mountain Valley Pipeline? There were several approvals that were pending. And in the last few months, we've seen a biological opinion released by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that details the impacts to endangered species. So that has now been released by the agency. And then just recently, we saw some decisions coming out of the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. And those decisions allowed MVP to cross the Jefferson National Forest and the Appalachian Trail. Still pending are the stream crossings permits. The Army Corps of Engineers has a federal 404, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. That permit is still pending because one of the requirements for that permit is for the states to authorize what's called a Section 401 water quality certification. And we, as Kevin had mentioned, we recently won a court case that sent our state agency basically back to the drawing board to fix some of the flaws in that water quality certification. They basically had to certify that MVP could meet water quality standards. And what we have seen and what we know is that they are unable to meet those standards. So as I mentioned, there was over 1,000 water bodies to be crossed by Mountain Valley Pipeline, and over 400 of those still remain. So this project is far from complete. The most sensitive water bodies and the steepest slopes still have not had pipe laid in them. And so over the course of this project, this has been one of the sticking points for Mountain Valley Pipeline is that they were not able to get this stream crossing permit. So they tried to use a general permit that was like a nationwide 12, and it's a permit that's not meant for a project of this scale. So when MVP, they couldn't meet the conditions in that general permit. So they actually tried to change the conditions of the permit so that they wouldn't have to meet them. And then there was a new permit that was reissued in 2020 by the Army Corps of Engineers that had those the changes to those conditions, but the court put a hold on it pending review. So then in 2021, MVP applied for an individual permit, and that's a more site specifics that details, each individual stream that would be impacted. And so that is the permit that is currently pending approval by the Army Corps of Engineers. So MVP has consistently had a flawed analysis with these stream crossing permits. First of all, they never established baseline conditions. We said from the start of this project that they have to have a detailed summary of what the conditions of those streams were, so that they would know whether or not they were impacting them and whether or not their restoration was successful. But they never, in 8 years, they've had 8 years to establish baseline conditions. We could have had 8 years of baseline in all of these streams, and they have yet to do that because they must feel like they're above the law. And so they've yet to establish baseline conditions. The methodology that they are using is outdated for the biological conditions. And then the benchmarks that they had described to determine the impacts had no scientific justification to them. They just drew numbers out of a hat or something, because there was no justification for why the values that they chose for when that stream would achieve restoration, there was no scientific justification behind it. And so in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals decision on the state's of West Virginia's 401 permit, what we had been asking for is that they explain how MVP could meet water quality standards when they hadn't previously. They had over 50 violations of water quality standards, and they didn't have any erosion control measures that were better than what they had been using previously. So the court ruled in our favor that they did not address MVP's violation history. They also did not require compliance with the stormwater permit, which is the permit that details those erosion control measures. They had no justification for the reliance on EPA's upland stormwater permit, and they had no justification for why they were going to forego that stream by stream review that we had been asking for from the get-go. So in this pending permit, MVP's identification of sensitive aquatic areas is basically guesswork. They don't provide assurance that all sensitive areas have been avoided, and their current route is not the least environmentally damaging alternative, which is required by law, by the Clean Water Act. They're required to provide select the route that is the least damaging, and they have yet to do any of that. So what we have before us in this moment is basically agency approval of flawed permit or pending approval of flawed permits. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's biological opinion, we have endangered species experts that we're working with that, still in the biological opinion, they feel that, the impacts to endangered species have not adequately been addressed. With the impacts to the national forest, those require a revision of the forest plan, and significant impacts will occur in the forest because of their ineffective erosion controls. And so those approvals we feel are unjust because we know that this project is going to have significant impacts, and the agencies are kind of glazing over those impacts just to approve the project. And then obviously I went into pretty good detail about the impacts to the water resources and why we feel that any approval of those water body crossing permits would be inadequate. And so because they are not able to meet environmental regulations and push this project forward, we are now faced with a potential for congressional approval. So for those of you that have been following this saga for the last several years, you probably saw last fall, this was attempted by Senator Manchin with the Energy Infrastructure and Security Act. And now we have another attempt by both of our West Virginia senators with the Restart Act and also the Building America's Energy Security Act. So basically what this legislation would do would require agencies to expedite the issuance of all permits for the Mountain Valley Pipeline without any additional public involvement and with no more judicial review. So basically, just pushing it through without following the laws, because those laws are in place to protect us. And by allowing a project to go through congressional approval and not follow the law, that basically sets a really bad precedent that this company is above the law. And we don't think that that's right. That tells West Virginians that our communities and our waters don't matter, that they can be sacrificed for company profits. So what can you do? We need everyone to align with us. We have an action alert right now. We have over 850 people that have taken the action alert that have told DC leaders to reject the unjust approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And there's a rally being planned with our allies in Washington, D.C. on June 8th. So I encourage you all to take the action alert, to come to Washington, D.C. and, really use your voice and, let the Biden administration know that, we cannot have these fossil fuel projects approved that are bypassing our environmental regulations. That's going to set a really dangerous precedent, because if they do that to West Virginia and Virginia, then they, have the potential to do that for projects all over the country. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I know that's a lot of information.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I imagine we have a lot of questions coming forward. I see Penn has raised his hand. Penn, you can be the first one to start us off with questions. And folks, feel free to drop your questions in the chat too if you're unable to come off mute.
Yeah, magnificent summary, Autumn. Thank you. So is there a June 8 March that I see? Is that what one of the action?
Yeah, there's a rally being planned at the White House.
Just to gather, just show up and swell the numbers?
Yes, I'm not part of the planning committee, but my understanding is that there will be lots of speakers and everyone coming together to, educate themselves about what's happening with the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and also just, have our presence be known that we are not okay with this.
And will there be information about that on your website, WV Rivers?
Yeah, there's lots of information online. Our partner in this fight, Preserving Our Water Heritage Rights, they are helping to coordinate it. People versus Fossil Fuels are helping to coordinate it. So we have a lot of our partners that are involved in the planning. We're at West Virginia Rivers, we're just trying to get as many people from West Virginia to go to DC. So that's kind of my role
Okay.
in the event. I'm not part of like planning the actual rally itself.
But it is a broader force you're hoping for.
Yes. So
Great.
in the fall, we had another rally, the Appalachian Resistance Rally, and there was thousands of people that attended that rally. So we're hoping for an even bigger crowd this year.
How broad is the coalition right now? How many states is included, and like what are the groups involved?
Yeah, so there are so many partners. I couldn't list them all. There, with the Mountain Valley Pipeline, there's also the MVP Southgate, which would then go into North Carolina. And so there are folks in North Carolina that are part of the coalition, obviously folks in Virginia and in West Virginia. We're all kind of coordinating to take different pieces of this opposition effort.
Yeah, it's a wonderful movement. I see Carol Denny has a great question in the chat. She was asking if you could give a little more detail about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's approval of the permit, which he says seems outrageous, which I totally agree.
Yeah, and I'll just throw a disclaimer out there that I'm not an expert on the Endangered Species Act, so I can speak to the specific species that are impacted in West Virginia, and then in general about some of those impacts in Virginia. So we have the endangered candy darter in West Virginia, and the critical habitat was designated after the route of MVP was planned. So Mountain Valley Pipeline is crossing critical habitat of the candy darter that's in the Gully River, and then some of the creeks in Virginia, the Stony Creek in Virginia has this critical habitat of the candy darter. And so in their biological opinion, they basically they said they couldn't tell you how many of the candy darter population would be impacted because the species is so fragile that they can't even go in and electrofish, like electroshock. They use like an electrical charge for identifying like the different populations in the stream. And they couldn't do that because they didn't want to harm the candy darter. So we don't know how many of the populations are actually, how many of the species are in the river. So they couldn't identify how many would be taken. It's when they kill an endangered species, they call it take. So they, in the biological opinion, they said they don't know how many candy darters will be taken. And so their incidental take permit is kind of a big question mark. And we don't think that's okay. And so that's one of the issues that the lawyers are currently looking at to see whether that biological opinion could be challenged.
That's a really great breakdown of the very, I think, particular situation. I see Bill's hands up. Before we get to Bill, I wanted to just use this opportunity to kind of ask a broader question about that. How do you guys advocate before like the BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and all these different sort of federal bureaucracies that obviously are kind of keen on passing through the MVP? What are some of the challenges you faced, and sort of have you kind of dealt with those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, we've been dealing with these challenges for the last 8 years back and forth. I think this is the third biological opinion that's been issued on the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So each time we've found additional flaws in them. Same with the U.S. Forest Service and BLM. This is I honestly like lose count how many times we've had to go back and review these same documents and had pointed out these same flaws. And it really does take a broad coalition, because it is impossible for one organization to follow all of these different agency approvals and all of the different massive amount of environmental impact statements and biological opinions that, we have to review when we are faced with this. So, it's not just West Virginia rivers, it's such a broad coalition of partners that are working together. And that's why we've been so successful in challenging all of these approvals and holding them accountable to the environmental laws. But all of that goes away if they can just bypass all of those laws and get congressional approval.
Yeah, Bill, I see you have your hand up. You want to ask your question?
Yeah, there have been some good articles written in Inside Climate News about the problems with the corrosion-proof coating that's defective on these pipes. Those articles have been tweeted about by Bill McKibben. Anyway, I put in the chat a new article that just came out a few days ago that has new information on that subject. And one of the questions I have is, do you know roughly how many miles of pipe is not yet buried? It's either sitting in open trenches or it's sitting on the right of way.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this pipeline is 300 miles long. We do have some of our partners that are looking at that information. They've actually scoured aerial photos over the years and tried to enumerate that. So I don't have that figure off of the top of my head. But I can tell you that, with over 400 stream crossings, there's a lot of pipe that is not in the ground. And so all of that pipe has been laying out in the elements since 2018. So we're going on, 5 years here. And the standards for the coating say that it shouldn't be out in the sunlight for more than 6 months to a year, or that coating will be degraded. And the significance of that is that that coating allows them to detect for leaks and it prevents corrosion. So without that protective coating, we're really setting ourselves up for disaster and putting communities at risk, because without that protection on the pipe, it's more susceptible to corrosion and leaks. And by leak, it's pressurized gas. So we're not just going to have a leak, we're going to have an explosion.
Exactly. And I would just encourage everybody and you to look at, you could just Google, if it's in the chat, but you just Google Truth Out and MVP. And this new article has some new information about this very topic you're talking about.
I also saw the question from Richard, but kind of corresponds to this issue about if Congress goes forward with I guess streamlining the energy permits. He's wondering if the debt ceiling bill passes before June 1st. Does that change the June 8th rally, and how does that affect kind of the advocacy plans?
Yeah, so currently they're trying to pass this legislation with other must-pass legislation like the debt ceiling. If you remember back in the fall, they tried to do the same thing with the budget. And so what we are asking for is, clean legislation, set the permitting reform aside and pass clean debt ceiling legislation. Now, the legislation that MVP is currently contained in is what they're calling the permitting reform. And so that's a whole nother animal. And so what we're asking for is to remove MVP approval from that permitting reform legislation. There should be no congressional approval of a project that is not able to meet environmental regulations. But yes, the June 8th rally will go on regardless.
Yeah, and I think that answers another question in the chat, which is it possible to actually construct the pipeline correctly and not endanger water quality or aquatic life? I mean, constructing the pipeline correctly kind of precludes those things as is.
Yeah, I mean, not in this terrain, it's not possible. And that's what we've seen over the years. When the project was first proposed, we were pushing for enhanced erosion control measures, enhanced inspections to make sure that our resources were not degraded. And then what we saw was that, every time it rains, that sediment just slides down the hillside into our creeks.
That's incredible. Alan, I see your hand's up. You're welcome to ask your question.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I just want to mention that the permitting bills say that Senator Manchin and Senator Capito on the other side of the hall are pretty bad. Fossil fuel industries all over it. But there is, for example, an Environmental Justice for All Act that Representative Grijalva is doing. So it is important that there is permitting reform, because for clean energy and good renewable, the grid needs to be modernized. So we want to say, I would say, and I think all of us would agree, we want to get behind a good energy permitting reform bill, but not with the fossil fuel handprints all over it and the MVP grease lined. So thank you. And
Yeah,
you
thanks, Alan. And as far as permitting reform, yes, we need to streamline permitting for renewable energy, but what in the recent hearings, what the agencies were saying is that the delays are because they are understaffed and they don't have the staffing capacity to turn around these, massive environmental documents with environmental impact statements and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of data and analysis that needs to go into those documents. And because agency budgets have been cut over the years, they are understaffed to be able to do the most adequate analysis that is needed for those documents. And so by providing additional resources for agencies, we can avoid a lot of those delays. And then in addition, we should be inputting more effort into involving communities early in the process, instead of limiting community input and having the community members have to resort to legal challenges. Involve the communities in the beginning so that those concerns can be addressed. And then you won't have all of the legal challenges where the communities have to use that as a last resort because their concerns are not being addressed in the permits.
I might also just quickly add, and thank you for that, Autumn, is that the government inspector is way understaffed. I mean, they're just literally, you might mention that. What is it? How many, infrastructure pipelines, so forth, does a typical inspector have to do? I mean, they just don't be doing good out there and watch what's going on. I don't know what the figures are, but
Yeah,
so
thank you for that,
why
Alan.
we need water testers. I mean, citizen water monitors and so forth. And you might mention that too, that you're working on that.
Yeah, we've got a lot of folks out watchdogging our rivers and streams to protect them because we don't have the adequate staffing of our agencies to provide consistent oversight.
Bill, I see you raised your hand again. Would you like to ask another question?
Yeah, I just wondered if there's been any attempt to draw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into this, because, she's obviously a champion of climate movement, but also my understanding is that it's, besides just Manchin, it's Schumer behind the scenes pushing this. And there's been some thought that she might take him on at some point for the Senate from New York. And I just think she would be a good spokesperson if she could be brought into this.
Yeah, I'll definitely relay that strategy to some of our national partners that are more engaged in that strategy.
Thank you.
Hi, Susan. I see your hands raised. You're welcome to ask your question as well.
Hi, Autumn. Thanks so much for the presentation today. It's helpful in preparation for the lobbying. I just wanted to say that I put something in the chat about organizing a run around on the rally day to bring attention to the issue. And I'm only going to do that in conjunction with the rally, Maury and the rally folks, if they're okay with it. But if anyone has interest in that, I'm a runner, and we're thinking about having to just say we're getting the runaround. You know, they're trying to bypass and run around the public and the environmental approval process by getting this expedited approval. And it just would be a sort of a public way. And there are a lot of runners in DC. There are a lot of people who would just probably come out for the fun of running. And so I just thought it would be a fun idea to add to it. So just putting that out there. If anyone is a runner or has interest in that, my email, I think I put my email in the chat. It's mmorganicfarm@gmail.com. Thanks.
Yeah, I love the creative activism. I know we've been talking about the federal level for the last few minutes, but I kind of wanted to also bring it back to the state level, because I know we have folks on the call from Pennsylvania and Texas who have their own particular relationships with the Department of Environmental Protection in those states and the challenges there. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the challenges with trying to advocate with West Virginia DEP, which seems to be gung-ho to also pass these water permits as soon as you challenge them, and some of the strategies you guys have used for organizing people locally to help sort of counter that.
Yeah, well, first of all, we have a great relationship with Department of Environmental Protection. I mean, when this project was initially proposed, they were so gracious with meeting with us. We had several meetings with all of the permitters and the inspectors, and they actually helped fund our pipeline monitoring program. So we have a great working relationship with the environmental enforcement, the inspectors that, while there are a few of them, they do their job very well and try to, cover, several hundred miles of this project. And I think we have maybe 12 to 15 inspectors. So they've got a monumental job before them trying to keep track of this. And our citizen monitors have really helped to provide some additional eyes on the ground to, check those erosion control measures and document failures. And a lot of our citizen monitors are responsible for all of those water quality violations that were issued. So we have a great working relationship on that front. However, we do hold their feet to the fire when they are approving permits that have flawed analysis to them. And so in that regards, we have been saying for years that they need to establish baseline, that they do need to do the benthic environmental and macroinvertebrate monitoring. And so in that aspect, we've had to resort to legal challenges because they have not taken those comments into consideration when approving those permits.
Thank you for that answer. I mean, the other kind of question that comes to mind is, since it's been going on for such a long time and it has a huge amount of national attention and such an important fight in battle against climate change and environmental injustice, I wonder what you're reflecting back on that time period, what your big sort of takeaways or lessons learned might be that you'd want to share with folks on the call who are advocating in their own sort of states and cities against similar kind of projects, smaller scale.
Yeah, I think we could have a whole webinar on that topic alone. But I think the biggest thing is just, the partnerships that we've created, because no one organization or person can take on a project of this magnitude alone. And so, like I said, we've trained thousands of community members and volunteers to go out and monitor the impacts to our rivers and streams from the construction, and then all the way up to the national, the partnerships with like national conservation organizations that have more resources and have more staff and expertise to help with some of the legal challenges. So it's really taken, everyone from, the impacted community member all the way up to, the person working for the national conservation organizations that can help with that very detailed technical knowledge of environmental laws and permits. And without the partnerships all the way through from local, state, regional, and national, we would not have been able to have the successes that we've had in this campaign.
I see, real quick, a question from Jenna, who was asking you to repeat the, how long they're allowed to be out of the ground, the materials.
Oh, the pipe, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's like 6 months to a year that they're allowed to be out in the elements. And we're going on like 5 years now that some of them have been exposed to the elements. So those pipes, the coating is not effective anymore. And they actually will need to be recoated.
And then Carol, I'm sorry. Carol in the chat has a question that you probably, I don't know if you can answer, but she's asking why Schumer is supporting it.
Well, if you remember, when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, there was a deal that was made between Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer, and that deal involved the approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So Schumer is trying to make good on his deal with Senator Manchin, and it's a dirty deal, and we don't think that our communities should be sacrificed.
I see, John, your hand's up, and after that we can go to Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Autumn. That was relieving to hear you tell me that as much as I hear of the completion of this project, I also hear contradictory, it's nowhere not near done, and you relieved me of my fears. For that, I'm grateful. I wanted to mention that they haven't, you said they haven't mapped all the streams and waterways that they need to cross. And I made me think of Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, Ice 9. And any water Ice 9 touched froze or whatever, crystallized, became inoperable, ineffective. And planet Earth is, the body of planet Earth is just like the body of your own, mostly water. And so that applies to the toxicity of, especially in streams, the surface hemoglobin around the planet for topsoil, touching everything. I mean, it's just a toxic mess. So I guess my question would be, what? I'm also grateful for that last remark you made about the length of time they can keep the pipes laying on the ground. But we have a plastic issue that is the most elemental example of the Ice 9 factor when I talked about all the water around the globe. What is the EPA and especially the engineers doing about the changing surface water with the flooding and then the dry out, especially, but the flooding going on all over our nation right now, especially toward the east. I mean, I may be 4,000 miles away from you guys, but the east is getting slammed. It's becoming nothing but one big deluge. And then up here, it's the same way when we have melting glaciers that are flooding out Anchorage, in fact. Why is the engineers not doing their job, I guess, when it
I would
comes
ask
to
that same question. But no, you bring up a really good point about the flooding. And so one of our concerns is that with more extreme flooding that we're seeing in Appalachia and around the world, is that, you know, the pipe could be compromised depending on how deep it's being buried. And so there's they had done a scour analysis, basically, you know, if there was a big flood event, how much of the stream bed, because you're compromising the integrity of the stream bed, right? By digging it up, by trenching the stream bed. And then, you know, if a large flood event comes and washes out that stream bed that's been compromised, you have the potential to dig up the pipe. And then with that flood waters bringing in large boulders and logs and all kinds of flood debris, you have the potential for that pipeline to be ruptured if it's not buried deep enough. So that is a huge concern that we have. And that's part of the site-specific analysis that we requested in the stream by stream crossing analysis for that scour analysis to be performed. And unfortunately, you know, we have not seen an adequate analysis to address that issue.
Well, thank you for that question, John. And Bill, I see or John, did you want to add something to it?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, and those stream beds are changing all the time too. So it's kind of moot almost.
Yeah, and the ground is shifting too. There are seismic zones. They're not as big of a fault line as we have like, you know, around Alaska and the Ring of Fire and, you know, the San Andreas, but we do have earthquakes and in this area, and they are crossing one of those seismic zones. And then we also have the issue of subsidence when, you know, the ground and the soil shifts and the soil is eroded. It erodes the soil out from under the pipeline. And we've seen the pipeline, they actually had to go in Lewis County, they had to go and dig it up because the pipe had shifted in the ground. And what we saw with the Leach Express pipeline, after it was just completed, it hadn't been in the ground for more than 6 months, and there was a subsidence issue and there was an explosion in Marshall County. So these are serious concerns that we have for our communities living along this pipeline.
Well, thank you, John. Bill, you says you have your hand up.
Yeah, everybody knows Schumer's in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry, but with Manchin is, I'm sorry, but with Schumer, you know, he talks about being interested in climate, but I think there's another reason he's behind this, because I believe one of the companies that's heavily invested in MVP is Consolidated Edison, which is headquartered in New York, if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, he's looking out for the best interests of one of the companies and probably one of the companies in his home state. And they probably also donate a fair amount to his campaign, is my guess.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bill. That's a good segue. I was going to take a moment to share the action alert in the chat again, to send a letter to Schumer, Harris, and Biden, telling them to reject the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And I thought we could spend the last couple minutes on the call giving folks a chance to sign it who haven't, and to write, if you would like to write your own custom comments, you can either submit the comment there or write your own in. And I know, Autumn, if you have any advice or tips to folks on what kind of things to say or anything like that.
Yeah, I think just expressing your concern about the precedent that this sets for allowing a company that cannot meet environmental laws to circumvent those laws and get approved through a congressional process. That sets a really bad precedent for this country. You know, if we're just going to allow companies to bypass environmental laws, why do we have them in the first place? We need them to follow the laws in order to protect our resources and our communities. And I'll just say that we've gotten over 850 folks responding to our action alert so far, and we appreciate each and every one of those folks. We also just submitted a sign-on letter to Biden and Schumer just today, actually, with 32 organizations, and we sent out a press release. So, you know, I'm hoping that, you know, the press will, you know, cover this issue and elevate it. I mean, we've seen it elevated to a national level, which is why we're getting so much attention. And really, you know, we just want to elevate the community members that are going to be impacted from this project and say that, you know, no community should be sacrificed for the energy needs of our nation when we should be transitioning out of fossil fuels to protect our whole world from the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very powerful, and I really appreciate your guys' activism on this and sharing this with us today. We have one more question from Robin in the chat, and she was asking if there are any precedents for Congress granting a permit for a pipeline like this.
Not that I know of, but I'm certainly not an expert on fossil fuel infrastructure projects across the country. You know, I recall there's the Keystone and the DAPL that I believe went through the environmental regulatory process. They were allowed to, you know, go through that entire process. And I think that Biden had rejected one of the permits for the Keystone XL because of similar issues. So if that permit was rejected for that pipeline, why wouldn't he do that for the Mountain Valley pipeline?
Great. Well, that was a wonderful presentation. Autumn, thank you guys so much for everything you're doing. We're really grateful to have you on and to tell us about this. That was extremely informative for me, and I'm sure for everyone else on the call. Folks, if you haven't taken the action, please make sure to do so. And then you can follow Autumn's work at West Virginia Rivers. I've dropped the link in the chat, and I'll drop it a link again in a second. But thanks all y'all for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking your time to listen. And if you have any follow-ups, please feel free to email us or drop your questions in the Halt Harm Network if you're a member. And yeah, thank you again, Autumn. It was a great presentation.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining today.